Welcome to the Care Advocates, where we're advocating for you. I am joined, as always, by my esteemed friend and colleague, Dr. George Ackerman, also known as Sharon's son, George. Welcome, George. How are you today?
Thanks. Always a pleasure to see you catch up. And as we take, short breaks or prepare for the next month, the world continues, caregiving continues today. Our guest is someone who means a lot to me because the topic of grief, I don't feel is discussed enough. Sometimes it's because it's troubling. Sometimes we don't want to face some of the tougher times, but she's out there inspiring so many, and I'm honored to have her on with us today.
Absolutely. And, I know you cared for your mother, Sharon. I cared for my father. And for me, one of the grief obviously is tremendous. And at times it can be overwhelming. One of the things that I found for my experience and a lot of the families that we talk to with our company is the anticipatory grief is sometimes the worst because, grief is definite. Anticipatory grief can be ongoing, but we can get into that a little bit later. But you set it up for us wonderfully, George. We would like to welcome Eryn Elder. She is a grief support specialist, and she is the author of Blooming Through Loss, Tending to Grief with the Bloom Path. Welcome, Eryn. How are you today?
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. I am well. I'm here in Colorado and must say I'm enjoying the summer here and appreciate having you. Appreciate the time you are giving me today to talk about grief. As George said, it's a topic that doesn't get enough attention and we all experience it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to first start off. You were sharing with us before the show started that your book had just been published. Why don't you share a little bit about your book and how it's gonna benefit readers?
Yeah, so my book, Blooming Through Loss, Tending to Grief with the Bloom Path, is part personal narrative, part best practices in grief care based in both research and evidence-based practices, as well as what I've seen in my own practice with clients. And it's a reflective guide. So at the end of each chapter, there are activities for the reader to help them process grief and loss and move with it with hope and understanding. And this book to me has been a long-term project. I have been working on it for over 5 years, and I started my career a long time ago as a high school language arts teacher. So writing has always been a part of the fabric of who I am. It wasn't until the death of my own daughter that I started to realize the healing power for myself in writing. And so this book is actually rooted in some grief poetry that I had been writing for many years over the past 10 years since my daughter's death. And with that, I sent that to my friend who's an editor over on the East Coast, far from me here in Colorado. And I sent her my compilation of all this poetry. And I was like, what do you think? Should we try to move forward with this? And she's like, I don't think so. I think you need to keep writing. There's something else there. And so I decided to include some of the poems in this book based off of, my collaboration with her and my understanding of how the poetry and my own grief experience has been so healing too. So it's neat about this book. It's not only what everything I said, but there's that personal depth there that takes you on a journey where I have been able to resurrect some of those poems and have them match the thematic cadence of the book. And it feels like I'm right there with you. That has been the feedback that I keep getting from readers and the reviews that I keep getting. People feel really companioned when they read this book.
And that's remarkable. Congratulations on the book, and especially because it's going to probably help benefit so many people. As George said, grief is something that I think everybody deals with. There's different stages of grief. There's different, scenarios with grief. But at the end of the day, it's still affecting people's mental well-being, their health, their emotions, even physically. Yeah, I would love for you to speak to this because, I had shared, we hear so much about the anticipatory grief, especially when, I think you have a loved one diagnosed with something like Parkinson's or dementia or even cancer or any kind of illness or, disease or disability. What are the differences from a clinical perspective of anticipatory grief versus grief?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I want to also honor that with anticipatory grief, there's also the ambiguous loss of a loved one, meaning they are still physically here, but not the same person they were, or they are maybe missing. physically somewhere else. So that's another piece that makes anticipatory loss so challenging, because it's often accompanied by this ambiguous loss as well. So I think just taking the time to honor that and recognize that is a good first step in understanding where you're at. So the other piece to this is being able to ride the wave of that grief experience and have a level of buoyancy with that can be a helpful tool in managing how you move through grief without suppressing emotions, without ignoring it. It's really about this gentleness, this lightness to tending to our grief, to understanding what's showing up in our lives and how that's informing how we relate to ourselves and the world. And to understand not only ambiguous loss, but any type of grief experience, I've developed the Bloom Path, which is the model that's in my book. And it looks at 6 internal touch points your grief will have with you and 7 external. And that way you can have an individualized experience in how you heal with your grief. And I know the word healing with grief can be a little bit touchy for some people, because we're integrating grief. Grief will always be a part of it. It's not something you completely overcome. But I still like the word healing, because I think grief shows up for us as a way for us to engage our worlds maybe differently. And through that understanding, through that healing, help us live a more authentic, a more embodied life. So that is the promise of grief. And I always think of everybody grieves. There has to be a reason why, right? Yes, it's a response to the loss of a loved one, but there's a lot of depth in what happens through the grief experience. And so for those who are grieving that anticipatory loss or ambiguous grief, that sort of thing, holding yourself with that care and recognizing and knowing those terms can be helpful. Also, having a strong support network and trying new things might be helpful too. In my book, I also have the 5 roots of grief support that I've developed, and it really looks at how you can have a level of care, a level of network, a level of emotional curiosity, because our emotions may be different than what we've experienced in the past, because that can be the promise of grief. It shows up in a new way. And so how do we tend to those with depth and care? And then the other piece that you mentioned is stages of grief. And, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her research, when she was developing that framework, the stages of grief was strictly for the people who were at the end of life themselves. And so we've taken it and applied it outside of its context, and she's critiqued this as well. And so we want things to be linear. We want things to have stages, but often that is not the case. And so instead, what I would like to think about, instead of acceptance, which is one of the stages of grief, I like to replace that word with receptivity, that we are now open and receptive to what's to come, and we can hold on to that love with our own care.
No, that's well said, Eryn. And, before I turn it over to George, first and foremost, we'll have this in the show notes, but I'd like to get it up on the screen for you. 2 questions. Where would you like people to go to learn more about you? And where would you like people to go if they'd like to get a copy of your book?
Yeah, thank you. So to learn more about me, my website is probably the best place to visit. It's www.rootsandwingsgriefcoaching.com. And on my website, I talk about my practice, the type of work I do. And there's a link to my podcast as well, and then the book as well. And you can find the book on my website as a starting place, but you can also find it right now at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and then you can find it more at the local bookshops around the Front Range here in Colorado right now. And then if anybody ever just wants to email me or reach out directly, I'm happy to send a book that way too.
What's your email?
So it's ERYN at rootsandwingsgriefcoaching.com.
Okay, great, Eryn. Before, like I said, I just have another quick question before we go to George, but a lot of times you see people, and I'm thinking about family members of my own, actually. My grandmother, when my grandfather passed, I feel like she grieved herself to pass. You grieve yourself to death. How do you help people that might be experiencing that and they can't let go of that grief? And I think, one, they're sad, they're missing that person, they're in mourning. but then even, 5 years on, or however many years you're the clinical specialist at that, they're still in that same deep mourning and grieving. And at this point, it's almost like they feel selfish if I stop grieving and I quote unquote move on, which I don't like that expression, but for practical purposes, I'm using it. It's almost being disrespectful to that person. Like, I'm forgetting them now because I'm no longer grieving. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. So
Yes.
how would you walk somebody through that to help them know and accept that it is okay to leave the grieving in the morning? You can still miss that person. You can still keep their memory alive, but you're not doing anything to, harm their memory, or you're not forgetting that person.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because it hits home very personally with me. And in the book, I talk about a few myths about grief. And that was one myth that I latched onto early on in my grief as well, that I had to be deeply grieving every day, all day, and could not let that go because that meant I was letting my connection go to my daughter. And so I'll speak first, I guess, at that personal level and then at the professional. For me, it did require a multifaceted approach, everything from therapy to body work to community and so many other things. And so I think being open to the idea of getting help is really important. And more recently, over the past couple of years, there is a new diagnosis within the psych field called prolonged grief disorder. And I do not necessarily align with that in my practice because grief doesn't have a timeline. On the other end, sometimes grief will show up, and as a result, some of our underlying mental health conditions that we're not necessarily presenting will also show up too. So I don't think that the primary is prolonged grief disorder. I think there is an underlying separate potential condition that could be supported through, whatever help makes the most sense to the individual. So it's a challenging place to be in. It's so heartbreaking, right? And I always love that concept of kintsugi in the Japanese art form, where we are threaded back together with gold thread. So their broken pottery is threaded through with gold thread, showing that that brokenness lets our light in and our light out into the world. And I think one of the key pieces to help people through that is being okay with that brokenness, and also being okay with moving in a way that brings us hope. And that can be scary. It's a scary step to take if we are really in our grief experience. But I think coaching is one of the key modalities that's helped me, and has the coaching model and the modality that I use in my own practice, because it allows for the grieving experience, but it also tries to bring in just very, very small steps and nuggets to have a level of movement, because our grief needs movement. And so we can have that movement by, really holding on tightly, or we can have that movement by taking walks, creating things, engaging in music, those sorts of things. And so I think just having an opportunity to recognize what type of movement for one's grief is going to be most helpful is another way to approach that.
Yeah. Do you think people need to be given permission in order to, take that step?
Yes, some people do. And I think we have to give permission to ourselves sometimes. And it's hard because again, at the cultural level, at the societal level, since we aren't talking about grief, we then hide in shame, because when we don't talk about things and normalize them, it can be a very shameful experience. And so at the other end of this, it's not just on the griever themselves. This is on our whole culture,
Right.
to open up the experience of grief to everyday conversations. I'm a very big advocate for grief education. Everybody grieves, but we get very little grief education, maybe through certain people's churches or spiritual practices, but we see it as kids growing up, and no one ever talks about that word. And when I go do trainings in organizations and they say, I'm going to talk about the G word, I'm going to talk about grief, you can just see the people's faces in the audience or in the training just kind of like pause, and there's an awkwardness, an awkward silence. about that word itself.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say, I think it's also even, you said society as a whole, but I also think then you go into the subcategories of that. In our subculture, I think for males especially, it's even more difficult because it kind of goes against the structure you're taught as a little boy, boys don't cry, that sort of thing. So I think it just adds another layer of complexity. So, thank you for breaking that down for our viewers and listeners and for the work you're doing. With that, I'd like to turn it over to George. George?
Thanks. First, I want to thank you, Eryn, for letting me be on your show, but also joining us today, and Lance for this show and all of our listeners, because I'm still grieving even 5 years later. So the only way I get through each day is through all of your work and your advocacy. And I think that's why the show is so important. But I was wondering if we could go back a little. Can you tell everyone what a certified grief counselor or coach that's dealing with loss is? Because I might be aware in Lance, but many people didn't even know that kind of existed, and that's a problem, I think. And I like talking about problems, so we could tackle them and, kind of bring them to the light for the world.
Yes, thank you for asking that. I think this question is hard because you're right. Most people don't know what this is, or not until they really have to know what it is. And so my modality is through a coaching lens. I am not a mental health therapist or a counselor. So I was a coaching administrator of a coaching program at University of Colorado Boulder. And I left that world of work to combine my professional expertise in grief support. And I think with that piece, we see in our graduate level counseling programs, and we see in any coaching program, that grief is not a main through line or a main thread in specialty. Often it's focused a little bit more on trauma or other specialties. So when I started to dig into that and find out that there's not people really specializing in grief specifically, it really, one, was a little empowering because it helped me feel like, oh, that's what I needed. That's where, I could use support. But it also really kind of helped me move forward in my professional experience doing what I love, which is coaching people. I love that modality. Just at the most basic level, coaching is a companionship where you enter into kind of a creative relationship, and the client knows the answers while the coach supports the client in discovering those, and then creates frameworks and movement with those through collaborative based strategies that you develop together. And so with that coaching approach, when I'm sitting with you, George, and maybe trying to develop something that's going to work best for you, right? That's going to look different than somebody else. And so coaching is really good about that collaborative piece of really companioning someone and coming alongside them. And so when you go to a grief support specialist like myself, that's what you would expect. That, I usually give a full 45-minute free consultation to start, to see if this is a good fit, or to see if a mental health counselor might be a better fit, or to see if there's another type of healing profession that would be a better fit. But coaching tends to really be a strong fit when it's, kind of after that hospice time frame has ended, a few months out to a few years out after a loss. I wouldn't say coaching is the most effective a few weeks to a month out after a loss, because of the way that it creates a certain level of movement with the grief. But that also, it depends on the individual. It depends on the experience that they're holding. So I think that's another piece here, is just the timeline can be so different for everybody. And then the other piece is I run groups as well. And through that, I still use the coaching modality. And what's neat in the groups is you'll see, with the Bloom Path in the book, everybody will be exposed to the Bloom Path in the group. And then they're each working within a different bloom, because that's where they're feeling most stuck or needing most support. And so that really shows the different type of support that people need. It's not the same for everyone, right? And so I think that can be really powerful too.
Yeah, as we wrap up, I just wanted to talk a minute about support groups, because you offer them. That's probably one of the toughest areas. I look to Facebook for support groups, which I feel was a mistake. But can you offer any, suggestions or advice for support groups that might be beneficial versus those that might not? And also can you talk a little bit about, your show also? Because I was really honored to be a part of that.
Yeah, so support groups can feel really hard because I think there can be this level of comparison, whether that is conscious or subconscious, and it can create a level of fear sometimes for people. I know a client of mine had mentioned, I don't want to go back to this specific support group that she was utilizing because um, people were at very different places and had been there for a really long time, had been there for many years, and she felt like that's not where she wanted to be that many years out. So it was kind of a scary experience for her in some ways. But I also think that support groups can be really helpful. So it really comes down to having that desire to find something that's going to work best for you. And it is trial and error. And it's not always going to be the first option that you look into or the first group that you try. And you get to be in the driver's seat with all of this through your grief and loss experience. And people need to be reminded of that because grief makes us feel so unpowerful that we have lost all of our control. But this is where you can have control by saying yes or no to what's going to be best for you.
I find, again, due to limited time, fascinating support groups because as we sit here, I'm not diagnosed with Parkinson's. My mother, unfortunately, is no longer with us. So I'm not actually a caregiver of someone living with Parkinson's. But I feel that, and I wrote a book on it. I didn't really want to write a book, but it's not anything out there. It didn't do great, but it was just that it's out there. But I feel that a lot of society forgets those who lost a loved one due to a disease and kind of ask them people to move on and just forget it. But I didn't want to do that because I didn't want my mother to be forgotten. 15 years battling Parkinson's, and then I think 15 years even after she passed, because she was only 69, which I think we talked about. So I called it literally an empty seat at the table because even today, as an advocate, I find trouble some days. People questioning why would I want to do advocacy when I can't bring her back. It's shocking in 2025 that people are amazed that we all want to just help others and not want anything in return. And that's all about grief. And, unfortunately, I'm still battling with it. I miss those phone calls. We spoke like 10 times a day on the phone, and now 10 o'clock comes or 5, and the phone is silent. So, or even another time every Sunday morning, my 3 children love blowing bubbles in the backyard with their grandmother, and you walk by Sunday morning and the backyard's empty now. So these are the things that I don't think there's an answer, but all we could do is look for individuals like you to help support us. I wish I met you before back then, but you never know. It's still something unfortunate that lingers. And I think the only way I'm getting through a lot of it is with incredible people like you and Lance and our guests, also our listeners, because you all inspire me to keep going. So thanks for your time. I'm going to also send it back to Lance to wrap up. But always, everyone listening, please reach out to us. And also, Eryn, she is someone I consider close to, and hope she knows that now.
Thanks. And I do want to say, you asked about the podcast, and
I had the honor to be on it, so I'm lucky.
Yeah. So George was a guest on a podcast that I co-host with my friend LaShawn Howard. The podcast is Coaching as Benevolence. And it's not about grief. It's more about coaching concepts for everyday life. Now, obviously, with my background, grief shows up quite a bit in the talk on the podcast. But we are so honored to have George come and speak with us and share with our listeners his story. Because one thing that I think just like bleeds out of you, George, is this authenticity and care. And I think people can be inspired by just listening to you with that and hearing your voice. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
I couldn't have said that better, Eryn, myself. So thank you for saying that about George. I'd like to also add, George mentioned, his book. Go to togetherforsharon.com. George has more than just a book, because I have a copy of all of them. He has an entire library of books that are all helpful, not only for people, facing, Parkinson's disease, but I think just for that familial connection of being a caregiver for a loved one, and even, policing in Parkinson's. That's a fascinating book for law enforcement side, but also for the family side, because if you do have a loved one, and we face this every day with our company, where family members are saying, how do we take the keys away? Is it time to take the keys away? My barometer as a non-law enforcement official is, would you feel safe getting in the car as a passenger with your loved one? And if it's no, then they shouldn't be driving. But I always recommend go and talk to their doctor, go with them to an appointment, take them for a driving test. But I digress. But yeah, go to togetherforsharon.com. George has a wealth of books there that are just beneficial in so many different ways. And, I'm thankful to call him a friend. And Eryn, thankful for the work you're doing. I too will echo what George says. I speak all over, and far too less is grief support talked about. People talk about caregiver support groups. Well, again, it goes back to that anticipatory grief. We hear about that all the time. And I think, having one-on-one counseling with someone like yourself, picking up your book. I was reading some of your reviews. I always like to ask authors, like with my book. I can't tell you the last time I looked at my reviews, but I was looking at yours this morning, and, it's nothing but 5 stars and all this wonderful feedback, which I know as an author myself, it's you're not doing it for that, but you're doing it for a purpose of helping people. So when you see those reviews, it's very affirming, that you've accomplished that mission. So Eryn Elder, thank you so much for everything you're doing. We'll have everything in the show notes, and we appreciate you joining us on the Care Advocates.
Yes, thank you both. I really appreciate your time today.
Our pleasure. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us again here this month at the Care Advocates, where we're advocating for you. We look forward to seeing you again here next month.